Hello again, members. Welcome back for another THF conversation. I'm Catherine McMacken, Membership Manager here at the Henry Ford. Today is the first of our periodic Member Appreciation Days. And as we start this special weekend, I'm so happy to welcome you back for our first virtual program for members in 2022. Nearly a century ago, Henry Ford, with help from agents and hundreds of everyday people, set about gathering objects that represented almost every aspect of everyday American life. And now we're in for a treat as we dig into that fascinating adventure. Our guest is Jeanine Miller, curator of domestic life, and she has been part of the Henry Ford for nearly 48 years. Interpreting history to visitors, working in the theater department, working as an archivist, and shaping and interpreting the collections as a curator. And she's fascinated, like so many of us, about Henry Ford's intriguing quest for the objects and stories that he felt were important to preserve. In fact, she often wishes she could have been along for the ride at that time. So we have so much to learn from Jeannie as she explores this story. As always, while you enjoy the program, please submit any questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We'll get to as many as we can at the end. And of course, to our members, thank you again for your ongoing support of the Henry Ford. We are so grateful that you continue to join us in our commitment to our mission as we activate new programming, new exhibits, and favorite experiences all year long. So now I'll hand it over to Jeannie to help us find out how all this stuff got here.
That title came from working on an exhibit years ago when we were talking about Henry Ford's collecting. And I said, you know, one of the things people want to know is, how did all this stuff get here? And the exhibit designer in the next design he showed us, there was a label that said, how did all this stuff get here? Henry Ford collected in a manner that very few individuals have. So while a lot of other wealthy men were focusing on fine art and furnishings, Ford was gathering objects that reflected the lives and accomplishments of ordinary people. Ford searched really widely, and while his vision remained the driving force, Ford did depend on others to help him amass this huge collection to support his vision for a museum and historical village. So now I invite you along for this look at the adventure that launched the unparalleled collection that is today the Henry Ford. And while I speak, in order to let you focus on the slides, I will turn off my video and I will be back near the end. Henry Ford was a farm boy with a mechanical bent, but he became one of the greatest industrialists that the world has ever known. His Model T had put the world on wheels, and it helped radically change it. By the early 20s, Ford's Model T had provided a means of affordable and unprecedented personal mobility for everyday Americans, helping to erode the traditional ways of life that Ford knew so well in his youth. Henry Ford was often uncomfortable with these dramatic changes in everyday life, and he sought to preserve some of the American past. And Ford's collecting began through a very personal lens. Ford began his restoration and collecting activities in earnest with the 1919 restoration and furnishing of his boyhood home on the original site. The house, as some of you may know, was at Ford and Greenfield Roads in Dearborn. This was a very detailed restoration, according to Ford's memory of his home from his childhood. He looked far and wide for a lot of things that he had recalled being in the home. And one of my favorite stories is about the Starlight stove that is in the dining room in Ford home. Ford launched a 1.5-year search for one of these stoves. He even had this ad put in the Detroit newspapers looking for this. Couldn't find one, couldn't find one. One day he was driving through Stockbridge, Michigan, saw one on someone's back porch, bought it, dismantled it, put it in his trunk, and off he went to take it back to Dearborn to put in the home. So following that restoration came the restorations of the endangered Wayside Inn in Sudbury, Massachusetts in 1923. He bought the inn and 2,600 acres that surrounded the inn to preserve the rural setting. 1923 also saw the purchase and restoration of Scotch Settlement School. This is the first school he attended as a kid, and later he would move that building to Greenfield Village. In 1924, the restoration of the Botsford Inn in Farmington, Michigan followed. So by the mid-20s, Ford had been actively collecting objects as well. In 1923, he was the primary collector of Americana in the entire world. But the things that appealed to him were those things everyday people had used, and in the products and inventions that had made their life better. So Ford had plunged right into his collecting, and by 1928, shipments of antiques were arriving almost daily at Ford Motor Company's engineering laboratory, from one item to sometimes railroad boxcars full. And he had to move his growing collection out of his personal office and store them in what was called Building 13, which was had been part of the Ford tractor plant that was located at the rear of the engineering laboratory. And this was the building that Henry Ford's office was also located in, so he could go over there and look at his objects whenever he wanted. So for nearly 3 decades, Ford would preserve hundreds of thousands of objects from 300 years of the American past, including historic houses and shops, machinery and tools, carriages, automobiles and bicycles, agricultural equipment, spinning wheels, looms, cast iron kettles, and apple peelers. He had the financial resources to support this collecting, and his assembly plant and dealership networks through Ford Motor Company provided logistical support for transporting the objects to Dearborn. Now, collecting on this scale was an absolutely huge undertaking. So Ford, of course, depended on scouts to help him find and acquire the type of objects that he felt were important to preserve. And ordinary people would help provide objects as well. So let me introduce you to some of these individuals to show you some of the objects or buildings that they helped acquire to fill what would become Henry Ford's museum and historical buildings. At the center of much of this activity was Ford's personal secretary, Frank Campsell. Campsell, who became Ford's trusted friend and confidant, took care of Ford's personal business. He answered Henry's mail. He made travel arrangements for him, and he even accompanied Ford and Clara Ford on many of these trips. Ford made the decision on what to accept or reject for his collection with Campsell's counsel. And Campsell would act as Ford's right hand on decisions regarding the village and museum purchases as time went along. So Campsell and another secretary, Harold Cordell, handled the voluminous correspondence with Ford scouts and with individuals. Tens of thousands of letters came. And as time went on, others assisted with the correspondence and the arrangements for shipping of the objects. W.W. Taylor was one of his early agents. In the early 20th century, this was the colonial revival era when people began to take an interest in early American antiques, and often especially those things from New England. William Wallace Taylor, always known as W.W., was a native New Englander. He was born in rural Newton, New Hampshire, and later moved to Haverhill and to Boston, Massachusetts. He started out his early adulthood working as a farmer, but by the late teens, Taylor was on the staff of the Society for the Preservation of New England Antiquities, now known as Historic New England. Ford had met Taylor while restoring the Wayside Inn, and soon Taylor was in Ford's employ. So beginning in 1923, W.W. Taylor would prowl his native New England countryside looking for objects for Ford's collection. And as a Yankee, a New Englander, he had the credibility and connections throughout New England. I do have to point out Taylor's tombstone there. I hope you did notice that it looks like a tombstone from the late 17th or early 18th century. And when I found that recently, I had to laugh, and I thought that's so W.W. Taylor. Taylor acquired some distinctively regional New England objects like the New England pleasure wagon or the New England plow, bar share plow, as well as some of the earliest American objects for Ford's collection, since that area of the country had been, of course, settled earlier, the East Coast. And the fruits of Taylor's search through Yankee homesteads, attics, and barns yielded a treasure trove of objects of all sorts: furniture, carriages, tools that would be used on the farm and also in the home. And not only did Taylor prowl old houses and attics and barns, he also purchased some things from New England antique dealers who did their own prowling in people's attics, etc. And here you see Frank Lawton's home and antique shop in Shirley, Massachusetts, as well as some things that Taylor acquired from him. Now, most open air historical museums tend, if they're going to move buildings to a historical village, they tend to move buildings within the region. And in fact, many Greenfield Village buildings did come from the Midwest. Taylor, though, acquired 19th century and actually late 18th century New England buildings for Ford's Village in Dearborn, so that people in this area were able to see the kind of buildings that were not readily at hand. And I just love that. These buildings include the Hanks Silk Mill, which was built in 1812 near Mansfield, Connecticut. And this was the first water-powered silk mill in the United States. And it's part of New England's fledgling early silk industry. He also acquired the Phoenixville Post Office from Phoenixville, Connecticut, built about 1825. It first served as a general store and apothecary, and by 1850, it had become a post office. The Rocks Village Toll House was another of the buildings that he acquired, built 1828 near Haverhill, Massachusetts, on the banks of the Merrimack River. And the toll collectors who worked here collected money from people crossing this bridge over the Merrimack River. And in their spare time, since traffic wasn't always busy, a lot of these toll collectors made and repaired shoes while they waited for the next customer. The Currier shoe shop, which is now in Henry Ford Museum, is a small 1880s shoe factory. They made women's slippers here. And it's an example of one of the many small factories that were scattered all over New Hampshire and northern Massachusetts. And often the only industry in some of these small towns at the time. And I love looking at the pictures of the houses on their original sites because it gives you such a feel for what it must have been like for these agents as they prowled around looking for buildings and objects for Henry Ford. Now, another of Henry Ford's assistants was Charles Newton. And he was involved in the acquisition of objects for the village and museum. He also handled some real estate transactions for Ford. But unlike Taylor, Newton was local. He grew up in Ypsilanti and attended the University of Michigan. And this is his house on Huron Street in Ypsilanti that he lived in as an adult. And you can also see a picture of the 18th century Wild Turkey Tavern barroom that he moved from Connecticut and put in his basement in Ypsilanti. You wonder if he came across this as he was working on collecting things, and that tavern is still in the basement today. Now, a lot of Newton's activities seem to have often taken place in the Midwest and in New York State, where Taylor was kind of focusing mostly on New England. And one of Newton's quests was to purchase general store stock, which he did at several locations, mostly in New York State, but also I think one in Pennsylvania, to stock the Waterford General Store, which Ford had moved to Greenfield Village, now called the J.R. Jones General Store. And he would just like buy up new old stock, and the stock would kind of range from sometimes as early as the 1830s into the 1920s, that was relatively new stock in these general stores. The letter that you see there at the lower right explains some of his adventures buying these materials. And you can see pictures of the general store as it looked in the 1930s, where some of these objects would have ended up. Now, Newton was also asked to prowl New York State for steam engines. And this letter describes some of his quest doing so. So not only did he have to find them, but of course he had to help arrange shipping, and you can see that in the photograph there. Other kind of things that Newton acquired included these heating stoves, which are currently on exhibit in the museum, and this mid-19th century carding mill near Connersville, Indiana, and this today is in Greenfield Village's carding mill. And I kind of hope as you visit the museum or village that you remember some of these stories and think about these agents who helped acquire these objects. Now, not everybody was actually employed by Henry Ford. Israel Sack was a very prominent dealer on the East Coast he worked in early American furniture, very fine, high-end types of furniture. And Sack had influenced the public's taste in antiques and helped both private collectors and public institutions build their collections. In 1923, when Ford bought the Wayside Inn in Sudbury, Massachusetts, Ford had asked Sack to help furnish it. And incidentally, Sack also acquired American and English antiques for colonial Williamsburg. Now, Ford liked acquiring furniture that had a history. So some of the things that Israel Sack acquired for him or sold him were the highboy that had been owned by Mary Ball Washington, who was George Washington's mother, John Hancock's card table, and the Lincoln chair, the chair that Lincoln had been seated in Ford's Theater when he was assassinated in 1865. And this chair has an interesting story. After Lincoln's assassination, the rocking chair was confiscated by the US government as evidence in the trial of the assassins. The chair was then sent to the Smithsonian Institution, where it remained in storage for decades. In 1929, the Lincoln chair was returned to Blanche Chapman Ford, the theater manager's widow, to whom the chair had belonged. It was a personal chair owned by Blanche and her husband. So Blanche Ford, knowing Henry Ford was collecting, sent a letter to Henry Ford offering to sell the chair to Ford for his museum. She was turned down by one of Ford's secretaries, who replied that Ford thought it was too gruesome a piece of furniture to put in his museum. Ford himself probably never saw Blanche Ford's letter, but disappointed by Ford's reply, Blanche Ford then decided to put the chair up for auction in a gallery in New York. And one of the people at the auction was none other than Israel Sack. And with Ford in mind, Sack purchased the rocker at auction. He knew that Henry Ford liked to collect furniture associated with great Americans. Sack's instincts were right. Henry Ford immediately bought the Lincoln chair for his museum. Now, not everything of the furniture items that Ford brought from Sack were associated with a famous person. Sack also helped Ford acquire some very fine early American furniture for the museum display, and a lot of that is still on exhibit today. Now, Jim Bishop was an old friend of Henry Ford. In this way, Bishop and Ford's relationship was different than some of these other assistants. Ford and Bishop had both been employed at Detroit's Edison Illuminating Station in the 1890s. By the 1920s, of course, Ford had long left the Edison Illuminating Company, but Bishop was then superintendent of the substations for the Detroit Edison Company, as it was then known. Bishop was younger than Ford, but he had helped out a bit when Ford was creating his quadricycle, and he was the first passenger when Henry Ford tried it out. In fact, Jim Bishop was one of the people who helped Ford break the wall down from the 58 Bagley shed to get the quadricycle out to take it for its first drive, because the doorway of the shed was too narrow to get the car through. And I think if you've been to the village, you've seen the shed and have heard that story. Now, Jim Bishop was an expert in early electrical equipment, and Bishop was the one who amassed the museum's unparalleled electrical collections. He collected very heavily for Ford. He gathered items associated with generating, conducting, controlling, and using electricity. And Ford wanted at least one of every such device ever made. And Ford knew he could trust Bishop's knowledge in these matters. Now, not only did Bishop acquire objects, he was also fabulous at gathering information that would otherwise have been lost. He could connect with people, and he knew what questions to ask. He carried on extensive correspondence with a man named Charles Clark, who had been chief engineer of the Edison Electric Light Company. And the Edison Dynamo Dumbo #1, which you see there in the image, was built after drawings that Charles Clark had made. And it was the first unit to go online in Thomas Edison's electrical generating station at Pearl Street in New York City in 1882. It's the only jumbo dynamo known to survive. So Bishop captured the information about how to install it and how to operate it, information that only Clark knew and was available nowhere else. So Bishop ensured that historical details like this were being captured. The jumbo was installed in the Edison Illuminating Company in Greenfield Village in 1944. And this is the reduced scale replica of the Detroit Electric Power Plant that Ford and Bishop had worked at. Now, Herbert Morton. Not all of the objects that Henry Ford gathered were American. Ford also sought British objects that he felt represented America's industrial and cultural roots. Herbert Morton was a Ford Motor Company plant engineer in Manchester, England. In 1928, he was kind of busy organizing the plant for the production of the new Model A, which was just coming out. But that same year, he was selected to search for very early English steam engines for Henry Ford. The Industrial Revolution, of course, had begun in England, and many of the technological innovations that would transform America from an agricultural to an industrial nation were of British origin. Ford told Morton that he was willing to spend up to $10 million on this project. And Ford and Morton went around visiting several of the oldest surviving examples of Newcomen and Watt and other engines. Ford would select what he wanted, and then Morton was then instructed to negotiate their purchase. Among the engines that Herbert Morton acquired for Ford is the earliest known surviving steam engine in the world. The history of this rare circa 1750 Newcomen engine, which lay in ruins by the 1920s, isn't really known, but we do know it was used to pump water out of a mine in the Lancashire coalfields of England about 1765. And as you can see from these examples of, from the pages of Herbert Morton's photo album, he would photograph each engine on its original site. He'd number the parts and then supervise the disassembly in England and then reassembly in Dearborn. And he acquired a large number of early British steam engines, which you can see here also in Henry Ford Museum. He even oversaw the replication of a 1780s Watt engine, since an example was not available for Ford to collect. And this collection of rare important engines is exceedingly significant. And as British Herbert Morton described Ford's collection of steam engines, he said they follow the development of every important application of power during the past 2 centuries, shown in actual specimen and arranged in perfect chronological order. Now, as Henry Ford's agent in Europe, Morton collected not only engines, but also antiques, furniture, and buildings, including the Cotswold Cottage from Chedworth, England, and the Sir John Bennett Jewelry Store from London. And if you look at the photo of the Bennett Jewelry Store, you'll see it was originally 5 stories high, but that would have looked a little odd in Greenfield Village. So Ford did a 2-story example. And if you want to learn more of Henry Ford's love of Cotswold and the story of Cotswold Cottage, you might take a look at a blog that I wrote last year. Just search Henry Ford blog and this title, Cotswold Cottage from English Village to Greenfield Village, and it should come up for you. There are a lot of photos that were taken during that time, so it's really kind of fun and interesting. Now, once word got out that Ford was collecting objects for a museum, thousands of people wanted to give or sell antiques to him. And Louise Hungerford was one of the, she wrote one of the hundreds of letters that flooded Ford's office during this time. In 1935, when she wrote the letter, 59-year-old Hungerford had sent a trunk full of clothing to Henry Ford, clothing that she said had belonged to her mother's family, the Mitchells, who had lived in the village of Port Washington, New York for 6 generations. And there's a picture of their house on the slide, which had been added onto over the generations. So by this point, there were fewer family members around that would cherish these garments. And I guess she thought Ford might be interested in them. So she shipped them off to him, and he did purchase them. And recently, as you can see by the exhibit in the lower right-hand corner, we exhibited some of the clothing from this collection. And there are 3 things that I love to point out. One is this late 18th century dress that is made in such a way that it's reversible, which we found kind of surprising. And these beautiful pockets that date from 1790 to 1810 are just full of these late 18th and early 19th century fabrics. And these sleeve puffs, they're about 1830, and this is the time period when women were wearing very puffy sleeves. And this is a very rare survival. You don't find people usually hanging on to these sorts of accessories. They don't usually get saved. And the garments that Louise Hungerford sent remain among the oldest of the garments in our collection today. Now, I'm going to tell you the tale of 2 dulcimers. Some people sold objects to Ford out of need. One of these people was John Holt. In order to purchase braces for his son who had been crippled by polio, in 1925, widower John Holt of Jersey City, New Jersey, sold Ford this circa 1900 Lion and Healy Perfection dulcimer, which is the kind of thing that was offered by Sears and Roebuck in their catalogs at the turn of the 20th century. Now, the economic depression of the 1930s likely encouraged some people to offer their family heirlooms for sale to Henry Ford. And some folks, like Lucille Anderson, knowing that Ford had deep pockets, sometimes initially offered their objects at more robust and kind of unrealistic prices. So for nearly a year in the 1930s, Lucille of Columbus, Ohio, she was a bookkeeper in her early 30s, bargained with Ford for her family's 1820s Appalachian dulcimer, gradually reducing the price during negotiations to something more in keeping with the actual value. Now, some people sent Ford newly made objects. And one of these people was Zemma Haynes Taylor, who was the wife of a Farmerville, Louisiana physician. She made this quilt for a quilt contest sponsored by Sears and Roebuck as part of the 1933 Century of Progress exposition. It didn't win. So she decided she was going to send it to Ford as a gift from the wife of a country doctor who appreciates the Ford car. And her letter in part says, I said you should get it because you, with your Ford car, has done more for the country doctor than anyone can imagine. For we travel over many rough roads with a territory of 10 miles and more to cover. My husband has practiced 40 years, so you can understand what a Ford means now. And this was true. This car was often known as the doctor's car, and you can see an ad there that talks about that. Okay, now Ford, besides people like Israel Sack, Ford also purchased objects from not so prominent kind of everyday people dealers. And one of them was Don Reed Felton, who was a farmer, but he also apparently had kind of a side gig as an antique dealer. And from the 1920s to the late 30s, Felton sold Ford hundreds of more kind of humble everyday objects, and many of them of a rural nature. And with so many objects he had to offer, he would often hand draw an image rather than, of course, photographing everything, which would have been more costly back then. And you can see in this letter in the upper right, some of these drawings that Felton sent along with his letters, which I find very charming. And Felton's brother, L.D. Felton, also a farmer, also sold some objects to Henry Ford. Now, some objects came as a bequest after the owner's death. And one such bequest was from Susan Stebbins Stark, who came from a well-to-do, educated Lansing family. Since young adulthood, Stark had been an avid collector of everything, literally from shoe buttons to cannons. And when she died at the age of 73, her 25-room house and 2 old barns were just bulging with stuff that she had collected. Susan has a little bit of an interesting part of her story. At some point, she had struck up a friendship with another collector named Byron Stark, who was a partner in a china shop in Kalamazoo, Michigan. And Susan and Byron would travel together to enlarge both of their antique collections. To make these quests a little less scandalous when requiring overnight treks, Susan and the much younger Byron married in 1928, but don't appear to have lived together much after that point. Now, Susan had willed her collection to several Michigan museums, including Henry Ford's, and she gave Henry Ford first choice of objects. We acquired thousands of objects, over 4,800, but I'm not going to show all of them to you, so don't worry. Susan's acquisitions included a broad range of prints, toys, books, and household items and tools. There are quite a few of these early prints that Susan collected that appear in village buildings like Smith's Creek, Grimm Jewelry, Eagle Tavern, and Firestone Farm as well. And there's some pictures coming up of toys that she acquired for us. Really quite charming things. Noah's Ark, several mechanical banks, some doll furniture, and this quite unusual to me doll clothes wringer. She also sent a lot of books, some of which were children's literature and other sort of books like this, but also some really great cookbooks for our collection. And then there were also these miscellaneous household goods and garden tools, like a bullet mold, the rocking chair in the Eagle Tavern's ladies' parlor, and this bed warmer upstairs in the Webster house. Now, sometimes Ford acquired collections that had been gathered by others. And one such collection was the collection of historic band instruments gathered by Daniel Pillsbury. Pillsbury made his living as a New York stationer, printer, and wholesale paper dealer. And he started collecting band instruments in the 1870s. He spent 25 years traveling extensively in the United States, and he gathered this really remarkable collection of 175 brass, woodwinds, and percussion instruments. I particularly like the serpent that you see on this slide. Pillsbury's collection was considered the finest of its kind in the United States. It was a rich, melodious array of the kind of instruments used in military and community bands that had provided much of the music enjoyed by everyday Americans in the 19th century. And a number of these instruments are on display in the Sons of America Gallery in Greenfield Village. And in a few minutes, I'll tell you another way where you can have a look. Pillsbury had died by this time, so Ford purchased this collection from Pillsbury's widow, and it arrived in Dearborn by rail car in early 1928. Another large collection that Ford acquired was that of T.C. Wohlbruck. Theodore Wohlbruck was a photographer in Worcester, Massachusetts, and he had moved to California by about 1920. He became a rancher, but he also continued to do some photography. He also collected horse-drawn and early automobiles over a 20-year period, and he had over 230 vehicles in his collection. He displayed them at this Museum of Equipages of the Horse and Auto, which was located in Redwood City, California. And the museum was located on a busy highway in the San Francisco Bay Area. But finally, not having in the mid-30s the financial resources he needed to continue to preserve and display the collection, Wohlbruck sold it to Henry Ford. Ford bought it, and once again, the collection traveled by rail to Dearborn. By the end of Ford's era, over hundreds of thousands of objects had been collected. So here's a little peek at how the village and museum were shaping up by the mid-1940s, near the end of Ford's life. Now, while Ford did have a great deal of assistance in gathering these collections, his influence really did extend to all areas of decision-making. Ford spent a good deal of time on site, especially in Greenfield Village. And the village did seem to be kind of a tonic to Ford. Well, Henry Ford's collecting, supplemented by many thousands of acquisitions that we have made in the decades since his time, remains a source of inspiration today. And today the collection holds millions of objects, documents, and photographs. So you want to know more about our collections and stories? Of course, you can visit the objects in person in the Henry Ford Museum or Greenfield Village. But two, our digital collections website offers a look at over 100,000 of these objects, with more being added every day. So you can look at things we've just collected, but you can also take a deeper look at the objects and stories I talked about today. For example, Herbert Morton's photo album documenting the history and acquisition of the Newcomen engine can be found there, and you can kind of click through all the pages. And also, our blogs offer more in-depth stories on our objects and their acquisitions. You see here one on the Lincoln Rocker, the Cotswold one I mentioned, Amelia Earhart's fashion design, and the Noah Webster house, which almost didn't survive to make it to Greenfield Village. So if you haven't already done so, you can sign up to receive links to our blogs, and I think you'll find a lot of stories of interest there. And of course, our book, Telling America's Story, offers a broader look at the history of the Henry Ford from not only Henry Ford's era, but also to the present. Okay. Back. And I hope you have enjoyed the stories I've shared with you today. This is a huge, complex story in its entirety. If I were to tell you the whole thing, we'd be here for at least a decade. And it was really difficult to narrow down my choices from the hundreds of possibilities. But I hope I've given you a feel for this adventure that was Henry Ford's early collecting for his village and museum. I would also like to acknowledge and thank the colleagues who provided assistance as I prepared this presentation for you by helping with researching some facts and also gathering some images for me. And I would also like to thank all of you for attending the presentation today. And now I think we have time for questions.
And we would like to thank you so much, Jeannie, for this excellent program. The stories behind the collections are so incredible, each and every one. And we're also lucky that you're here to share them with us. So thank you again. And yes, as you mentioned, we have time for some questions. A few have been submitted already, but they're coming in fast. So members, keep those questions coming. We started out with several questions about Frank Camsell. I'm seeing, questions asking where he's buried, where his home was in Dearborn, and if he had any kind of experience or like even credentials in collecting or museum work. Kind of like, how did he come to do this work and where did he end up?
Okay, that's a lot of questions. I'm trying to remember. I think I showed you a picture. Did I show you a picture of Camsell's home? I think I did. I believe that was on Military in Dearborn. This is a good general question. Do these people have experience in museum work? The answer is no. Virtually all of the people, except for people like Sack, or say, the knowledge that people like Jim Bishop or W.W. Taylor would bring to it. He tended not to hire museum professionals to help him put together his museum. He had some very definite vision about what he wanted to do. Did that answer?
And what a collection of folks that he assembled.
So it was, okay, well, it is, the house is on Military, I'd forgotten, okay.
Absolutely. And we also have a question about Newton's home. Debbie asks, where in Ypsilanti is that located?
I think I can remember the address. I think it was 220 Huron.
Excellent.
The street that runs north and south. And I have to say, did I see something that says that E.G. Cutler's grandchildren are here today? Is there something to that nature on the chat?
perhaps let's
If
see.
so, that's
Oh,
so exciting. And yes, I didn't have time to include him today, but his story is very much told in the book. And he was the one, while he may not have been doing the initial acquisition of the buildings, Cutler was in charge of moving them to Greenfield Village.
oh.
Yeah. So
I can
welcome.
only imagine.
So nice to know you're there.
Yeah, thanks. We got a message from Alison, you're right, in the chat that, yeah, 2 of E.G. Cutler's grandchildren are joining us today. I can only imagine cataloging every brick in a building like, Cotswold or any of the others that came.
Yeah.
A massive undertaking that would have been.
Massive undertaking, lots of responsibility and lots of numbering of parts.
Absolutely. We have so many great questions. Another one that came in asks about another kind of player in the mix. What role did Clara Ford play in these acquisitions?
Clara Ford played a role, but as far as I can tell, not a huge one. Initially, she would go to Building 13 and sometimes do these like artistic arrangements of some of Henry Ford's objects. And I did show a picture of that, one of those at the very beginning of the slide presentation. She did take a lot of interest in things like the Garden of the 11th Heart, which she was a gardener. So of course she was interested in that. She insisted that bottles be on the shelves of the now Eagle Tavern. Henry had some taken down and she walked in and said, "Where are they?" And she's like, "Put them back." And apparently when Ford came in the next time and he said, "Where are they?" And they said, "Mrs. Ford wanted them up." And he went, "Oh, okay, that's fine." So we know that she did play a role. And I see that there is a letter where she's asking Cutler to move a light switch. That's fascinating. I'd love to see a copy of that. If you could contact me later. So she did play into this, but not, of course, to the extent that Henry Ford did.
Absolutely. And here's the next great question from Rob. He actually is sort of shifting the tone to the village, similar to, you mentioned Clara had some influence there. He asks, were the wonderful artifacts in Menlo Park Lab donated by Edison, or was that a purchase?
That is a great question. I debated about including the story of Menlo in this presentation, but it's a complex story. There's a group called the Edison Pioneers. People had worked with Edison or in some of Edison's businesses like the electric light plants that helped gather some of this material because the buildings had been abandoned and had been taken, boards taken off of them in many cases. And I'm sure that the, a lot of the equipment would have been moved to West Orange Lab where he went after that. So things had to be gathered up again, and there were a number of people who helped with that. So that's, the Menlo story is probably a story unto itself that could take up the whole period, and perhaps someone can tell that story in the future on the THF.
Absolutely.
I hope
always
that
more to learn.
Yeah.
And we also have some curiosity about some of those items that Americans kind of sent in for the effort, rather than those that were specifically sought out by the team. Did Henry Ford and his agents accept all of the gifted items, or did they ever send any back?
Well, we don't always know if somebody like actually packed stuff up and sent it off. We don't necessarily always have documentation for that, but often people would send a letter first. Louise Hungerford was one of those people who just sent the stuff. And no, they could not accept everything. And I have seen letters where they have turned down some of the offers that people made.
I can't imagine how you would choose from amongst all of those thousands. I mean, I'm sure they had criteria, but it must have been a difficult choice.
Yes, especially in an era where you couldn't just take a cell phone photo and send it off.
Oh, absolutely. Like the drawings and the letter, those were so, charming and
Yes,
helpful,
I
of course,
know.
in the effort.
The first time I saw that, I was just amazed. He could draw pretty well.
Yes, hopefully, yeah. There's another question here about a specific artifact that you showed a picture of, and that's the Lincoln chair. Do we know what the Henry Ford paid for the Lincoln chair when it was acquired by, I think, by SAC?
I'm not sure if we know exactly that, but I will tell you the circumstances of the auction were such that it was occurring at I think a time and place where perhaps there weren't a lot of bidders. I believe Israel Sack, according to a note I had, paid like $2,400 for it. But I don't know how much Ford paid for it. So.
Absolutely, thank
Yeah.
you.
But, I'm sure whoever sent the letter back saying Ford wasn't interested, I'm sure they knew he liked furniture that was associated with people, but they, thought that the assassination was not the happiest topic. So, but it's good that SAC was on the ball.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's so good that Henry had a whole team, helping him out. Everyone seemed to sort of bring something different to the table and what they thought would be most important or useful in the museum. And it
Yes.
certainly all worked out. And we do have then another question about kind of Henry's influence on that process through the team or otherwise. Did Henry Ford ever express any kind of his own feelings about specifically collecting vehicles from competing automotive companies?
Henry Ford rarely captured anything in writing. Of course, Frank Hansel and the secretaries are answering his correspondence. Ford was not somebody to share a lot of things in writing. He was more someone who would do it in talking. In some cases, he would go through antique shops or, in London, he's like, oh, I really want that Sir John Bennett jewelry shop. And then he'd send somebody to take care of getting the objects there. But in other cases, especially with somebody like W.W. Taylor, I think he gave him probably broad description of the kind of things he was looking at, and that Taylor would have gathered things according to those instructions. Did that answer the question?
Yeah, maybe as much as we can.
Yeah, there's a lot I can't tell you because we don't have the documentation.
Absolutely. Well, here's one about a specific building that you showed us a picture of, the shoe shop. We've had a couple questions asking, where in the museum did the shoe shop end up?
It's in Made in America. If you walk through that exhibit, you'll see the small building there. It was in the village when it first came, but when they did Made in America in 1992, they thought it was a great example to talk about these early kind of cottage factories and moved it to the museum.
Oh, definitely. So does that mean that that building has been disassembled and moved and reassembled twice then?
I did not watch that process happening. They may have had to take it apart somewhat, but not entirely, or they may have just moved it. It probably would have fit through the back doors of the museum, but I'm sorry, unfortunately, I don't know that.
There's always more research to do, right? There's every question could be its own research project.
Yes.
Well,
and yes, A Home for Our Heritage is a fabulous book. Here it is. We all refer to it. This came out in 1979 on the 50th anniversary, and it gives a lot more detail than we've often been able to give since then, because our later books are trying to cover the history of almost 100 years of the Henry Ford. So it's also a nice book to try to get a hold of if you can.
Oh, that's a great recommendation. And thanks to you, and thanks to Alison who put it in the chat. That's so helpful. I think we're getting close to the end of our time, so maybe we'll do one more question.
Okay.
So our last one will be, if you had to choose just one of Henry Ford's agents to ride along with in this project, who would it be and why?
Boy, that is a hard one, because there are definitely moments and places and objects that I would have loved to be shadowing these people while they acquired them. But if I had to choose one, I would go with W.W. Taylor. I love New England, and I love W.W. Taylor's insider quality. He was part of these communities, so he could probably get in places and have conversations that it might have taken other people a while to create. And you know, I would just love to have crawled around the New England countryside with him in this era when there were still a lot of people that had these things in their attics and their, you know, barns, and they were things that their family had used in previous generations. And the other bonus would be, he would be there talking to the people whose families had used these objects. That is always just so delightful and so enlightening. So it would have been nice to meet and talk with them. And I have to say that as I started here as a guide many years ago, so I used to be out in the village giving tours of some of these buildings that he brought. So there's a personal connection there. And many of the objects that he acquired relate to the domestic life collection, which I am the curator of. So it'd be W.W. Taylor.
Absolutely. I'm sure you guys would have a wonderful time, you know,
Oh, yeah.
tootling around back roads and finding incredible stories. Well, thank you again. That looks like that will be the last question we have time for today. So of course, thank you, Jeannie. Thank you to everyone joining us for today's member program. We love to share our passion for history and for the Henry Ford with our members. And we're so grateful that you continue to connect with us in our virtual programs and in our events like Member Appreciation Days. So as we wrap up, we'll give a thank you to our ongoing partners in membership at DFCU Financial. And of course, thank you again to all of our members for all that you do to support the Henry Ford. We'll see you next time.